Dear friends of Jesus Christ, I wonder, who is your favorite character in the Christmas story? Or maybe I should put the question a little differently. When you were a child, what character did you want to play in the Christmas pageant? Mary is definitely the star of the show. She gets her own song. She gets a special visit by the angel. And then she gets to be pregnant with the special baby Jesus. Most girls want to play Mary. The Magi are the wise men, are pretty cool too. They come from a faraway place. They carry gold and frankincense and myrrh. For the boys, the wise men is about as good a role as you're going to get in the Christmas story. Being a shepherd isn't too bad either. You get to wear those nice long flowy robes and get a good view of all the cute little angels. But what about Joseph? What about Joseph in the Christmas story? It's usually the kid with the least amount of acting skills that ends up landing Joseph's role, right? All you have to do is walk from here to there, and then you need to sit. Can you handle that? Joseph doesn't get any lines in the Christmas story. He doesn't say a word. His main job is to sit beside the lowing cattle and the baying sheep. Church art, the history of liturgical art, it's filled with pictures of Mary and the baby Jesus. But Joseph rarely makes an appearance. He doesn't seem to like family pictures. When the camera comes out, he heads to the workshop or hides somewhere in the background. Who is this quiet man, and what is his role in the birth of Christ? Joseph gets a fair amount of stage time in Matthew's account of Jesus' birth, but he still doesn't land any lines. He's a thinker, a dreamer, a doer, but not a talker. But he doesn't need to talk to be effective. His speech is to quietly do the will of God. I wonder what it was like for him to hear the news that Mary had to share with him. Did he say anything to Mary when Mary told him that she was pregnant? Or did he quietly head back to his workshop to mourn and to think? Matthew tells us that Joseph was a righteous man. We've been learning about that word righteous this fall. A righteous man is someone who is conscientious of his responsibilities. His desire is to live uprightly and with integrity in his relationships with God, with his neighbor, with himself, and with the world. This is Joseph's aim. He's a righteous man. I'm sure as he tinkered away in his shop, he was mulling over this question in his mind. What's the righteous thing to do in this situation? Marriage was a three-step process in Joseph's day. First, there was the engagement period, and this was often an arranged thing. So parents would get together and arrange for their children to be married, or they'd hire a professional matchmaker who would arrange a marriage for the family. Next came the betrothal period, a period that lasted about 1 year. The couple lived apart during this stage, but they were preparing for their married life together. Legally, in the eyes of the law, they were essentially married during that time. And the only way to break things off during the betrothal stage required a certificate of divorce. And then finally, the third stage was the wedding day and the married life. Mary and Joseph were in stage 2, the betrothal stage. They weren't quite married, but they were as good as married. And all that was left for them to do was to consummate the marriage and start their life together. But that's when Mary told Joseph the life-changing news. Joseph may have only been a simple carpenter, but he wasn't stupid. He knew how babies were made. What's a righteous man to do? Well, under Mosaic law, Joseph had a few options at his disposal. He had a loud option and a quiet option. The loud option involved taking Mary before the elders of the town and having her charged with committing adultery. Under Mosaic law, she could be stoned to death for breaking God's law and for breaking the marriage betrothal or the betrothal. The benefit of this is that it was a public act that made things clear. Joseph would be totally vindicated. His name would be cleared. He could start all over, find, a new wife somewhere else. The shame and the guilt would fall entirely on Mary, and he could start again. So that's the loud option. The quiet option was his second choice. This involved writing up a certificate of divorce. Mosaic law also said that a man could divorce his wife if he found out something indecent about her. Only 2 witnesses needed to be present to make this official. Word would eventually get out, people would talk, but at least Mary would be spared the public shaming and stoning. Being a righteous man, Joseph chose the second option, the quiet option. Frederick Dale Bruner says this about Joseph's actions and righteousness in general, and I think this is helpful. By giving Mary a letter of divorce quietly, unguilty Joseph was prepared to take social shame on himself without complaint, and such decisions are forms of Christian righteousness. Righteousness is not only the determination to be personally impeccable or sinless, but often the determination, if necessary, at one's own expense, to bear the guilt of others. So given the circumstances, Joseph chose the righteous path, what he saw to be the right way forward. That's at least what he thought, but God had other plans for Joseph. That night, as Joseph slept, he had a dream about his situation, and in his dream, a divine messenger came to him and said this, "Do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived of her is from the Holy Spirit." The law told Joseph to divorce. The messenger told Joseph to marry. This won't be the last time that God rejigs the law in the light of Christ, but it is the first time. A new thing is happening in the world. And Joseph is discerning enough to see it. We don't know if Joseph woke up the next morning with an ethical headache. All we know is that he went and did just as the messenger commanded him. He took Mary as his wife, and when the baby was born, he named the baby Jesus. It's helpful to note, I think, that Joseph is the one and only character in the Christmas story that doesn't talk back. When the messenger tells Mary that she will give birth to a child, Mary says, "How can this be? I'm a virgin." And when a messenger tells Zechariah that he and his wife Elizabeth are going to have a baby boy named John, Zechariah says, "How can this be? I'm an old man and my wife is well along in years." But quiet Joseph doesn't question the messenger or the message. He hears and he obeys. It should also be mentioned that these acts of obedience would have been quite costly to Joseph. I imagine that he, like most of us, had a vision for what he wanted his life to look like. I imagine he was, during this betrothal stage, busily planning out the next 5 years of his life. Marriage, kids, maybe building a business, buying some property, building a home, thinking it all through, setting up his life just how he thought it might go. But God's new thing upended Joseph's plans completely. He was now the laughingstock of his community, foolish enough to marry the woman pregnant with someone else's baby. And what's more, in order to protect his adopted son from a bloodthirsty king, he'd have to flee to Egypt. That wasn't part of the 5-year plan, I'm guessing. And then upon returning to Israel, he'd have to settle in an off-the-beaten-path town, once again, in order to protect his family. But so far as we can tell, quiet Joseph shows no sign of resentment or disappointment. He simply submits himself to the amazing new thing that God is doing in the world. He is a servant of the righteous one. His speech is to do the will of God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And it's this selection, God's selection of Joseph and Mary. I find this to be one of the greatest aspects of the Christmas story. God partners with ordinary, humble people to do extraordinary and amazing things. Mary was just a young woman, but God chose her, invited her to participate in the drama of salvation, and Mary responded with faith. May it be to me as you have said. Joseph was just an ordinary laborer, someone who worked with his hands to make a living. But God chose him to be the protector of the Christ child, and Joseph, at a great cost to himself, responded with obedience. It's such a delicate beginning, isn't it? The hope of the nations cooling in the hands of a young mother. The Prince of Peace being protected by a poor peasant. Together they make the long, dangerous journey to Egypt. Together they make the long, dangerous journey back home. The word of life in an infant sling. His parents worrying about where their next meal will come from. It's so delicate. And of course, God's grace, it comes first. The messenger comes to Mary. The messenger comes to Joseph. Something new is taking place inside of Mary. None of this is the result of their hard work. This is God's work. And yet they are being called to participate in that work through faith and obedience. You know, in the Roman Catholic tradition, Joseph is considered to be the patron saint of families and the church. He's referred to as the protector of the church. And if you consider that Jesus is the seed of the church, this beginning of this new community, you can see why Joseph is considered to be the protector. He carries the light, and he protects it from the evil that wants to snuff it out. This is why there's a St. Joseph's Catholic Church in nearly every city on the planet. In addition, many hospitals are named after Joseph too. He's a place of refuge. Reformed Christians don't give saint status to Bible characters or other famous people in church history, and for good reason, really. For at the end of the day, Jesus is the only name by which people can be saved. And at the end of the day, even Joseph, Jesus' adopted dad, will bend the knee to the boy child he named in Bethlehem. And yet, on this second Sunday of Advent, I think it is fitting for us to thank God for Joseph and to wonder how we might be called to participate in the ongoing drama that is Christmas. The truth is that God is still at work in the world. The truth is that he still chooses to partner with humble men and women to do his work. And just as the Christ child was entrusted to the hands of a carpenter, so the Christ story is entrusted to the Spirit-empowered church. We carry the light with us, the treasure of the gospel residing in jars of clay. It's not our obedience that brings people into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. It's Jesus who does that through his Spirit. But God is pleased to partner with us in the ministry of the gospel, in the ministry of sharing good news that brings great joy for the people. I'm thankful for the quietly faithful people who shared this story with me. For my mom and dad, for Pastor Ralph Coops, for my friend Brad Kinech, for my teacher and mentor Rebecca DeYoung. A few years ago, I was talking to a fellow gardener in the Agnes Street Garden Co-op down the street. She asked me what I did for a living. I told her I'm the pastor of the church just down the road. And she said, "Oh, is that the Christian Reformed Church?" And I said, "Yeah, that's the one." And then she said, "Oh, do you know so-and-so?" she asked. I can't remember the name. I wish I could remember the name, she said. But I do remember at that time recognizing the name. And so I responded, "Yeah, I know that person, but actually she died just a few years ago." She had passed away just a few years before that time. The woman said this, "Oh, that's too bad. You know, that woman really encouraged me. We barely knew each other, but one day when I was going through a tough time, she called me on the phone and she really encouraged me to trust in the Lord. She encouraged me and she gave me hope. That phone call had a big impact on my life." I can't remember that woman, but I remember when she shared the story, I'm like, "That woman? She did that?" I would never have guessed. Quiet old lady, but quietly faithful, doing the work of the Lord. I wonder what quiet obedience might look like for you this Christmas. Maybe that means quietly enduring shame so that the light of Christ may be seen all the more clearly. Maybe that means moving out on a scary journey so that the light of Christ might be seen in a scary place. Maybe that means dropping your own vision for life and finding your role in the mission of God. Maybe that means cultivating a deeper relationship with God so that you are able to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd. And of course, if Joseph were here this morning, he probably wouldn't appreciate all the attention he's been getting. He'd probably prefer it if we put him back in his spot next to the lowing cattle and the baying sheep. "Don't look at me," he'd say. "Look at the baby. Look at the Christ child. Jesus." You know what that name means, right? It means the Lord saves. The messenger told me to name Mary's baby Jesus because he will save God's people from their sin. Behold the child who takes away the sin of the world. See the one who bears your guilt and shame. Set your eyes on the Prince of Peace, God's bearer of shalom. He's worthy of your life, your strength, your all. There's no better way to live than in service to him. Amen.